I'm Eddie Glaude. I'm the Chair of African American Studies here at Princeton University and the William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies. I'm a scholar of African American religion and a scholar of John Dewey, and I bring those two together. John Dewey is a philosopher, American pragmatist, and part of what I've been trying to do is to kind of understand the social and political role of African American religion in African American life in this country. And one of the things that I do in my work is that I make a distinction between African American religious life and African American religion. And let me say a little bit about what I mean by that. And it's important. There's this assumption that African American religious life, right, is absolutely critical to the overall circumstance of black communities in this country. In some ways, and that's absolutely true, that black civil society, right, schools, insurance companies, right, social organizations like Masonic temples and sororities and fraternities and a range of organizations in some ways have their beginnings in African American religious institutions, particularly African American churches. And in some ways, black churches were the cornerstone, right, of black life in the country, having everything to do with the pervasiveness of the impact of slavery. Christian churches were the primary sites that African Americans created for themselves to imagine themselves differently, to be able to imagine a sense of self apart from the relation of domination that was slavery. Now, but it's really important to understand that African American religious life isn't reducible to African American Christianity. And we'll say a little bit more about that. That African American Christianity is just one dimension of a broad and complex and varied religious landscape. Frederick Douglass, for example, in his narratives, right, talks about Sandy, right, the old African slave who gave him a charm that gave him the strength to resist Covey, right, the slave breaker. Right? In some ways, and what that moment in the narrative suggests is that there's a whole tradition, right, of conjure that define the African American religious landscape. I often tell the joke of my mother, who is a devout Catholic, when I had the measles, using an old remedy of sardine juice in a rag and tying it over my head. The same remedy is actually listed in Zora Neale Hurston's The Sanctified Church. So conjure is one feature where you have a range of knowledge about the world as such and how one could use that knowledge, right, to heal and to harm. It's a religious system. It's a theological system in some ways that informed and shaped the life world of slaves. And you have, of course, traditional African religions that are still evident and prevalent in African American slave communities, right? So you have the Yoruba tradition. You have a range of, as Al Rabateau, the great historian of African American religion, would say, the African gods did not die, right, across the Atlantic. They made their way to the United States. They made their way into the New World in different forms and different shapes. So not only do you have holdovers of traditional African religions, you have conjure, but you also have Islam. Right? You have African Americans who emerge, who are rooted in the Muslim tradition, and we have the archives showing records of African Americans praying 5 times a day, even in the context of slavery. Now, of course, Christianity dominates. We see African Americans convert in large numbers around the Second Great Awakening. We see them forming their own religious institutions. In some ways, the fissures, the kind of conflict that would become the Civil War, we actually see beforehand in American churches as Southern Methodist and Northern Methodist split over the question of slavery. We see debates within white Baptist communions, as it were. We see debates around slavery in the Presbytery, right? And African Americans are finding their feet in these denominations, and in some ways, putting their distinctive imprint on African American religion. The great Howard Thurman, the theologian who pastored All People's Church and was a major force at Boston University, wrote this wonderful line where he said, "The slave dared to redeem the religion profaned in its midst." And so what we see over the course of the antebellum period. It's African Americans forging a kind of rich religious life that would become the cornerstone of African American culture and life. Now, I would say this, but I made a distinction early on that there's a difference between African American religious life and African American religion. African American religion, I think, is a category created by scholars to understand the role of black religion, right, in the political lives of black folk. And I say that to make this point, right, that religion, what makes it distinct, right, what makes it distinctly African American is not just simply because African Americans practice it, right? If that was the case, we would be talking about black Buddhism, right, or black Baha'is, right? There's something about the distinctiveness of the religious formation in relation with, right, the realities of white supremacy in this country, that these religious vocabularies offer a way to account for the world and to imagine oneself differently. So African American religion, we could talk about African American Islam, we could talk about African American Christianity, we could talk about black Judaism, right? We could talk about these various and very distinctive forms that are New World, that are very, very much reflections of the New World, right? As being in part and parcel ways, tools, resources for African Americans to imagine freedom, to construct a particular conception of the self, an idea of the self apart from the gaze of the master, apart from the gaze of white people. And so African American religion, though, can't be reduced, let me say it differently. African American religious life can't be reduced to the category of African American religion. African American religious life is vast, it's complicated, it's nuanced, right? It ranges across different practices and different traditions. Not all of those traditions speak to the reality of African American life as a kind of practice of freedom, as I might say. But African American religion is that creation of the scholar to make sense of how African Americans have leveraged, how they've used religious language to make sense of their circumstances, to imagine a world that could be otherwise, right? What the great historian of religion, Charles Long, says, the use of the lithic imagination, right? This way of seeing beyond the obscurity of now in order to imagine a better dream, to imagine a better world. So I think it's important for us to understand African American religion in all of its complexities. How do we move from slave religion, right, to the prosperity gospel of today, when you have preachers talking about sowing a seed and how that seed is an indication of one's salvation, right? There's a long, complicated history, but what we do know, even over the course of that long, complicated history, is that African American religion remains at the center of African American life, both culturally and politically.